Hello and welcome back to the God of War Knockoffs collection. This isn't the first entry in my series of videos on this topic, but you don't need to watch the others to get an idea of what I'm doing here. Basically, around the mid-2000s into the early 2010s, a lot of games attempted to play off the gameplay formula that God of War had established and make their own game with it, because massive success begets imitators. This resulted in many similar games, some good, some bad. The degree to which these games ripped off God of War varies from entry to entry, but it's a very specific weak attack, strong attack, grab, block, quick time event, high angle camera formula that can be instantly recognized, much in the same way that you can instantly recognize a game that ripped off the Arkham Asylum Style punch counter combat. I was struggling to find a connecting theme for the various potential games I could have covered until I noticed a fairly recurring pattern amongst some of these games, because here's the thing, most games that attempted to rip off God of War got at least one sequel, wasn't intended to be a franchise, or was part of an ongoing franchise in itself. However, there were also a lot of games that were intended to launch franchises but fell flat on their face the moment they left the birth canal. There are some cases where you can only presume that it was meant to launch a franchise, but in other cases it was well publicized that there were supposed to be more games before a sequel or sequels ultimately never materialized. So today I thought I'd take a look at games that attempted to launch a franchise while attempting to play like God of War but never made it past the first game. So this is the God of War Knockoffs collection, Failed Franchise Edition. Heavenly Sword is a perplexing case, because it's a game that undisputedly plays like God of War to the point that you can't really argue that it wasn't trying to. Even my Guinness Book of World Records Gamer Edition from 2009 said as much, but it's also a first-party PlayStation exclusive. So why would a first-party PlayStation exclusive exist that literally rips off another exclusive? It's a really odd situation. My working theory is that Sony wanted a God of War game on PS3, but Santa Monica Studios were either unwilling or unable to get God of War 2 on PS3. So Sony may have seen what Ninja Theory was working on and decided to pick the game up as sort of a stopgap exclusive. I would have presumed this game got commissioned for that exact reason had it not technically been in development since 2002. However, my guess is that since it plays almost identically to God of War, most of the work on the actual gameplay was probably done in the last 2 years of development. This is a game that I've been meaning to cover since moment one of this concept, because it's one of the best known examples of its kind. But is it a diamond in the rough, or is this a franchise that never took off for good reason? Well, it starts off strong enough with a flash forward to the final battle, where our main character, Nariko, is having her last stand. However, shortly after, the power of the Heavenly Sword is too great, as it was never meant to be wielded by mortal hands, and she dies on the battlefield, and the rest of the game is spent catching up to this moment. Wow, a flash forward to the end of the game that depicts the main character dying? Where have I heard that before? The plot as it is doesn't really have much. There's a man named King Bohan who wants to take the Heavenly Sword so he can use its power to bring the tribes of the world to their knees and create a new golden age. So Nariko is trusted with protecting the sword, but is forced to go against orders and wield it in order to save her father. And the rest of the game is more or less just a prolonged game of cat and mouse, where King Bohan and his various lieutenants try and take the sword. Granted, there is some emotional intrigue, such as Nariko learning that her own father, Shen, wanted to kill her. The reason being that Nariko was prophesized to be a divine warrior, but for various reasons, she was seen as an affront to that prophecy, but despite his clan's wishes, Shen couldn't bring himself to do it. So despite the simple framing device, there is some stuff that you can sink your teeth into with this game, and the performances are surprisingly good. I'd say the two that really stand out would be Anna Torv as Nariko and Andy Serkis as King Bohan. Anna Torv plays it relatively straight. She's headstrong and has an appealing take-no-shit attitude.
I swore to Kai that I would never leave her. I cannot forsake that now. You've taken my life. What more do you want?
Meanwhile, Andy Serkis as King Bohan is almost comically over the top.
But you see, the sword is mine now, and it is residing safely in my armory with all my other trinkets. Roach!
He's seemingly a mad king who almost lives in his own little world. Like, I zoned out for a moment at one point, and I practically had to spit take when he said this.
For the moment when she can sink ruthless slavering jaws into my sacred genitals!
That's funny. With that said, however, much of my goodwill for the story is taken back by the character Kai, who is without a doubt one of the most obnoxious fictional characters I've ever encountered.
Bird or worms? It's tasty.
She's the last surviving member of a tribe that was wiped out by King Bohan, but she's essentially a feral child who speaks absolute nonsense. I think it's supposed to be endearing, but I found it really annoying. Also twing twang.
Twing twang.
Twing twang.
Twing twang.
I will say no more. Gameplay-wise, as I said, this is almost identical to God of War in many ways. You have a series of light attacks, heavy attacks, grapples, and so on. The first thing to note about this game for me is that I think it lacks the elegance of God of War in many ways. The combat overall looks and feels very chaotic. And it's one of these games where there are a lot of combos, but none of them to me are distinctive enough to stand out, especially because many attack animations look similar, as there's only so many ways you can swing a sword. So I never really found any reliable go-to combos or attack sequences. This I genuinely believe is a failure on the combat engine. There are multiple types of combat engines for sure, and I think some people conflate complexity with quality, whereas some of the best combat engines in history are ultimately very simple. It's just about knowing what you want to do and building into that for maximum quality. God of War may be my favorite franchise, but each individual weapon doesn't really have a massive amount of combos. But each one is distinctive and its usefulness is immediately apparent. And of course you have things like Bayonetta, where there are enough combos that they can get lost in the shuffle, but most if not all of them are bombastic enough that they can stand out. And failing anything that can add a level of distinctiveness to the combat, it makes Heavenly Sword feel like a button masher because there's no immediately obvious strategy to the combat and no immediately standout attacks. But even then, the main issue with the combat engine to me is that there's no block button. You see, one of the things they did with this game that I actually quite like is instead of giving you multiple weapons, it gave you 3 separate stances with the proper main weapon. By default, you're always going to be in the regular stance, and to switch to ranged and heavy stances, you hold L1 and R1 respectively. So while the individual attacks and combos may not be distinctive, you have different combat modes that you can switch to on the fly depending on the situation, which does add a level of appealing variety to the combat. While the Heavenly Sword may not seem like the greatest weapon in the world as far as feel and the combat presence, they chose to put all their eggs into one basket instead of having several potentially mid-additional weapons. And I always prefer a refined experience over pointless variety. However, because of this, it means there's no block button because they had to waste 2 button inputs on different stances and more or less ran out of buttons to map. So what they do instead is that they have Nariko automatically block regular attacks if you aren't currently attacking, and she'll block heavy attacks if you're holding R1, the heavy stance button, and aren't currently attacking. It's a decent compromise in theory, but in practice it really doesn't work well. The ability to switch between attacks and defense seamlessly is one of the things that made God of War combat so smooth. But by making it so there's no way to cancel out of an offensive maneuver to defend means that with every attack, you leave yourself open, which will bite you in the ass more often than not. A decent compromise would have been to either relegate the stance switches to the D-pad, or they make the R1 and L1 buttons switching, then have either R2 or L2 block and counter. The only use those buttons have is to pan the camera, and considering this game is a God of War-esque game, it has a mostly fixed camera, so being able to control the camera even slightly is really pointless. Also, without a proper block button, that means that the countering system is really arcane. If you properly time hitting the triangle button when an enemy's attack connects, you'll either do a strong or weak counter depending on how well you timed it. But there's also color indicators that indicate what kind of attack it is, so you can counter accordingly. It's something that works in theory, but here's the issue. It requires enemies who telegraph their attacks, because you need to not only prepare for their attacks quickly enough to hit the counter at the correct time, but you also need to be holding the correct button depending on if it's a strong attack or regular attack. So you essentially need twice the telegraphing, and yet you basically get half the telegraphing because in most cases it's like half a second before the attack animation starts and you taking damage. It makes a lot of fights really frustrating, especially when you're getting swarmed. or are fighting enemies that have a tendency of blocking all your attacks, so whenever I actually successfully pulled off a counterattack, it was more down to luck than anything. And in the cases of enemies that block all your attacks, it forces you to use nothing but the combos that guard break, really limiting the amount of attacks you can pull off. Also, I know it's probably an odd thing to complain about, but I really hate it when games have it to where you have enemies that insist on incessantly blocking all your attacks. Because in cases where they spend 80% of their time blocking, like in this game, it doesn't add difficulty, it just prolongs the fight. And the thing that puts the final nail in the coffin for me, Heavenly Sword was a PS3 exclusive that came out in 2007. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this was before Layer came out and completely killed off the 6-axis concept, which means Heavenly Sword heavily uses the 6-axis for various things. Now, I'm gonna go on the record here and say that 6-axis as a concept was always a gimmick and never once did it actually enhance a game. This is no different. It's primarily used with projectiles, where if you hold the fire button, you can manually guide the projectile with the 6-axis. It's awkward and imprecise, and you need to accurately shoot with this thing, which makes certain sections hell on toast. But to this game's credit, you do have the option to turn it off, which is actually more mercy than I was expecting. And I find that when you have a quantifiable measurement, such as the range of an analog stick, you can actually gauge the range of movements much easier than having a theoretical range of motion using motion control. But even once you understand that, the handful of missions where you play as Kai are interminable because she has no other way to defend herself other than using her crossbow. And I would have really appreciated it if they would have thought to add an auto lock-on to the nearest enemy if you're going from regular gameplay to aiming mode, because if I'm running away, the camera is not facing the enemies, so trying to realign my shot when I turn around costs me precious time that might cost me my face. Funnily, I actually had to redo one of Kai's sections because after I finished it, the cutscene to the next area wouldn't activate, which almost made me quit the game because that was not a short mission. And finally, while I find all the bosses very imaginative, especially Flying Fox, who looks like a second cousin to Valdo and sounds like the Monarch from Venture Brothers.
Now we're coming to my favorite part. Also, we're not gonna have to sit through hours of me abusing myself to Marky Post.
But as I was saying, I find that the bosses universally have way too much health, so these fights can drag on and on and on. But I do acknowledge the possibility that since I'm going into this game completely blind, this might just have to do with me not knowing the pro strat to properly damage each of these bosses. But they do have a checkpoint between each bar of health, so either I'm missing something, or these are deliberately ridiculously long epic fights. The final of these bosses against the Raven King in particular is one of the most obnoxious fights I've ever faced. Conceptually, it's not bad. Granted, it's a little bit goofy. Naruko yells at the spirit of the sword in order to allow Naruko to defend the sword from becoming a spoil of war.
All you will become is a beautiful object to be admired behind glass. And then you will gather dust. Then you will die.
I don't know why the spirit of the sword cares about its own perception, but from there, the Raven King, who is this malevolent spirit that's been present throughout the entire game on the side of King Bohan, then possesses King Bohan in order to counter the spirit of the sword. So it's a battle of heaven versus hell. And it's awful. From beginning to end, it was 39 minutes. Granted, I did die a few times, but it's ultimately not a very hard fight, it's just that he has absolutely stupid amounts of health. So it's more or less just a battle of attrition trying to get through the fight. And they restore your health between chunks, but you could have cut this down by 2/3 and still had a worthy final boss fight. It's just excessive. Now, I'm gonna spoil the ending, but I don't care because this game is really old. It was incredibly ballsy for them to kill off Naruko, but if I know anything about game stories, she was destined to make a comeback in the next entry. But that was the last we ever saw of Heavenly Sword, short of a few guest appearances and an animated movie. This series was apparently intended as a trilogy, but the second and third games were never made. A sequel was briefly in development by SCE Cambridge Studio, but it was quickly scrapped because Sony decided the franchise was no longer commercially viable. Which is funny because I remember this game being heavily marketed at the time. I speculate that the release period was what ultimately did this game in. 2007 was not a good time for PlayStation whatsoever. That was when the PlayStation 3 was being trounced by the Wii and Xbox 360, so its commercial viability was hindered from the start. Which is sad because I feel that this could have potentially been a successful franchise. Despite all of my issues with the game, I don't think it's bad. It's functional and sometimes fun. There's a solid foundation here that I think with some refining could have been great had they stuck with it, and I believe Naruko could potentially be a marketable character as sort of a female answer to Kratos, especially these days now that female protagonists are much more common and widely accepted outside of a fringe of people I want nothing to do with. I mean, this was during a time when executives were afraid of making games with female leads because it could potentially negatively alter sales even by a small amount, which was too much in the eyes of the bean-counting executives as they buy their 8th yacht. But now it's something that's much more widely accepted, so I would like to see this series make a comeback. It has a lot of untapped potential, and hey, with the marketing machine behind it, who's to say we couldn't reanimate this corpse? Asura's Wrath, made by CyberConnect 2 and published by Capcom, is yet another game that was recommended to me for this series, so if you get angry at the idea of it being compared to God of War, take it up with my commenters. You'll probably know Asura's Wrath as that one game that made you pay for the ending. Yeah, it definitely has a reputation, it does. Now, if you're counting this as a game that is in any way inspired by God of War, I could see it. Aside from playing similarly to God of War, the plot also has some pretty significant similarities. A powerful demigod characterized by his anger is betrayed by a pantheon of deities, resulting in his own death as well as the death of his family, although in Asura's case it's only his wife that dies. So said demigod decides he's too angry to die and comes back from the afterlife multiple times in order to wreak havoc on the pantheon. Plus, there are some other ideas as well as set pieces that do feel somewhat inspired by the goings-on of God of War, but I'm not going to say whether or not that was intentional. Although there is one detail that I refuse to believe was not intentional. One of the main villain's names is Deus, which is exactly one letter from, yeah, you got it. There's a lore and history present here that is incredibly deep and intricate, the type of mythology that would take hours to go into and is ripe for expansion. It's actually genuinely overwhelming. I like it, don't get me wrong, it's a very interesting mythology, but it feels like starting this game up, you're given an entire encyclopedia's worth of knowledge to try and decipher, and a lot of it slipped through the cracks because of how front-loaded it is. From what I understand, the setting and storyline is sort of a combination of Buddhism and Hinduism thrown into a pot and mixed with a little bit of science fiction. I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, but given how complex this mythology is, I'm bound to get something wrong. You are Asura, the literal physical embodiment of wrath in this mythology, hence the name of the game. Him and the other 7 Guardian Generals each represent each of the 7 deadly sins, plus an extra deadly sin for the physical embodiment of melancholy. Wrap your head around that. Essentially, they are the Guardian Protectors of the planet of Gaia, although it's spelt G-A-E-A, which should be pronounced Gaia, but never mind. Anyways, the Guardian Generals are in a constant struggle against the Goma, the impure, these monstrous creatures that reside in Gaia. This game throws a lot at you very quickly. It starts in medias res for a start, as you're in what seems like a final battle, and you even neutralize what's called Goma Viltra. But after their victory, Asura is framed for the murder of Emperor Strata, who was actually murdered by another one of the Guardian Generals and the embodiment of pride, the aforementioned Deus. Asura is killed and then returns 12,000 years later to find hell on Gaia. The 7 Guardian Generals have become deities in their own right and are working to achieve something called the Great Rebirth. You see, the Goma are essentially the embodiment of Gaia fighting against the people who occupy the planet, so using the power of Asura's daughter Mithra, they want to harvest a bunch of the souls of humans on Gaia in order to cause what amounts to a complete hard reset of the world, which they see as the only way to achieve true peace. What I just told you is the most truncated possible version I could give you. Like I said, there is too much to go over succinctly. It feels like for every one combat arena, you have 5 minutes of cutscenes, and then you even have extra story bits between chapters that fill in some of the blanks. The best way I can describe this game is like if Akira Toriyama made God of War, and I feel like that will make half my audience weirdly interested and the other half completely turned off. There are so many set pieces in this game that seem straight out of Dragon Ball Z. Personally, I do enjoy the plot for how absolutely audacious it is. It has equal parts stupidity and conviction that makes it very compelling. Asura's Wrath is a game wherein one of the first boss fights is the size of a planet and still loses to a man who decides he's so angry that his rage breaks reality, so he wins anyway. And I find the personalities and overall story progression to be so over the top that you can't help but get invested in it because you're questioning what new ridiculous height they're gonna reach in the next episode, which does create some power creep issues, but that's besides the point.
Understand, even if I send you to Naraka.
I will say, however, Asura's characterization is extremely on the nose. I find it gets really wearying having to hear every 5 minutes about how angry he is from himself as well as every other character.
Perhaps I have underestimated the power of your wrath.
I'd say Asura's Wrath is self-explanatory, and you know, if the title didn't give that away, you don't have to explain it. His actions speak for themselves, I'd say. Another thing that frustrates me about this game outside of anything interactive is the structure, where it has an episode system that includes credits, previews, and recaps of every single episode. But these are not long episodes. They only take you 10 to 15 minutes apiece, so it feels like they're exclusively trying to appeal to people with severe ADHD. Although I do find the to be continued screens hilarious, mostly just because it reminds me of that one JoJo meme that was popular a few years ago. However, despite its issues, I still rather enjoy the plot for what it is. It's stupid fun that's so over the top I can't even tell if it's being played straight or not.
That is my intention!
But it's one of those games that I'm almost paranoid to actually go in depth on summarizing because I'm almost certain there's going to be something I get wrong. Now, as far as the gameplay, you may get the wrong impression at first because the first 20 minutes or so is a rail shooter interspersed with QuickTime events and non-interactive cutscenes, with Asura and the other demigods doing a full-scale assault on the Goma. I'm gonna officially write a cardinal rule of game design here, and this should be written into stone. The first interactive moment of gameplay should be the core gameplay. Because if you start with something unrelated or do some superfluous side mode, it'll give the player the wrong impression. Which is a shame because once you actually do get into the gameplay, it's actually a pretty solid game for what it is. You got all the usual staples, light attacks, heavy attacks, grapples, counters, and so on. The core combat is actually pretty good. It's very simple in that there aren't really any real combos that utilize light and heavy attacks together because the heavy attack is specifically used as an area of effect attack and takes some time to recharge. That is unless you activate the unlimited gauge after filling up your meter, so I guess that's Asura's Wrath's version of Rage of the Gods. So a lot of this game is spent mashing the light attack button and countering any major attacks that come your way. But simple as it may be, I actually find that it works quite well, at least for a while. It feels very reactive, so there's a certain level of impact to the combat. I describe it almost as crunchy in how the blows land and how they feel. But if there's one thing I can criticize about this game is that it feels so restrictive in how the world is built. Most of the time, you're launched into a single arena to take out a bunch of enemies until you fill up your wrath meter, at which point you can unleash your final burst that will end the fight. So a lot of the gameplay is just fighting people in the same spot until the game decides you can move on. But the problem is, most of the time it's only single individual arenas. Almost every time you move on from the fight, the game launches into an extended cutscene mixed with QuickTime events. I'd say the actual gameplay of this game is like 40% QuickTime events, which is just absurd. And even the QuickTime events sometimes feel too rigidly determined, like how in the button mashing sequences, the game literally won't let you succeed until a specifically designated point determined by the cutscene in the background. Then many of the QuickTime events can be failed without any sort of repercussions. The ones that will cause you to lose some of your health for the upcoming fight are in a severe minority to the ones that just count towards your completion percentage. So if they're gonna have as many QuickTime events as they do, I would like for them to matter more. And as far as the main gameplay, I would like a more interconnected world with more sprawling levels before we are subjected to ridiculous cutscenes. Let me traverse a little bit more, let me explore, because failing that, there's essentially nothing to the main gameplay other than simply combat. And as good as the combat is, it's still very simple and lacks depth. I would definitely prefer a game that doesn't split its focus, but at least does a little bit more than one thing. That way, it can give you a bit of downtime between the absurdly massive fights. And that way, it wouldn't feel like you're being shoved down a rigidly determined path dictated by the game. I don't want a full sandbox, but a little bit more openness would be nice. Although in fairness, this game does split its focus somewhat, as there are various other points in the game where you have to fight through rail shooter segments. I don't know, I don't find these rail shooter segments particularly engaging. It's mostly just spent holding down the light attack button and occasionally tapping the heavy attack button. And I never found it particularly hard, so this was definitely a mode that felt like it was added more for the sake of the story and connecting the larger fights rather than for its depth or interesting gameplay. Although interestingly, the same attacks that you use in the rail shooter segments can actually be used in standard gameplay, adding a sort of ranged component to the game. But personally, I never really felt compelled to use the ranged attack in standard gameplay because the enemies were almost always right on top of you, and the ranged attack in standard gameplay doesn't really do much damage. So yeah, the gameplay is definitely flawed, but I still played through it, at least to the end of episode 18. This is the part where I would talk about the DLC ending, because the game very famously sold its last few episodes as well as the true ending for $7, as I said before. This was during an era when Capcom were complete douchebags who had no respect for their audience, which would make them fit in great today. There was a long-standing rumor that the DLC ending was meant to be part of a sequel, but the game flopped, and so Capcom released the DLC ending to quickly patch this up. However, there's never been any legitimate proof of this. It's always been nothing more than a rumor. I've also heard that their excuse for having the ending be separate from the game itself had to do with the fact that this was attempting to be an interactive anime. And you see, some animes in the past have had a big movie to tie up the story. But then again, that was probably complete BS anyway, as I don't have any reason not to believe that they were just trying to squeeze a little bit of extra money out of this. Regardless, I opted not to play the true ending, and that's for one reason. I think the game really wore out its welcome by that point. As impactful as the gameplay was, I don't think it was nearly deep enough to be able to carry a game like this for the full length of the game. And as good as the story was, I found that the length of the cutscenes, combined with the fact that what gameplay was there were short sequences that felt very inorganic, I just didn't quite have the interest to want to get the true ending when I already knew basically what I thought about the game. I was satisfied enough that I didn't feel the urge to press on. But a brief summary of the DLC is that the spider that helped Asura in the afterlife comes back and reveals himself to be the man behind the curtain from the beginning, so then you have to fight him. Overall, I think this game is certainly good, but wouldn't call it great. There's definitely much worse games out there of this style, but this is not one that I'll go out of my way to replay in the future. It's an extremely ambitious game with a lot of interesting ideas, but it obviously only garnered a cult appeal, and whatever was planned for any hypothetical future installments never came to be. Which is a shame, because I feel like this concept has a lot of untapped potential. But Capcom has never shied away from killing off their intellectual property if they're underperforming, so while some may cry at the funeral, it's probably not worth it, as it's not going to change anything in this case. Okay, I admit I am cheating with this one because X-Blades did have a spiritual successor a few years later called Blades of Time, but come on, when else am I going to get a chance to cover this game? Plus, it was only $2.99 on Steam, so give me a break. Now, I'm a big fan of the show Zero Punctuation. Aside from Ross's Game Dungeon, it's the only review show I will go out of my way to watch whenever there's a new episode. And the first time I'd ever heard of X-Blades was during his Halo Wars video, where a guy from another show on the same website did a guest spot where he reviewed X-Blades and succinctly explained why it's a poor man's version of God of War. So up until now, that had been my only exposure to the game. So does that opinion hold up? Honestly, yes and no. X-Blades has the superficial appearance of a God of War style game, especially with the extremely lightly dressed warrior dual-wielding blades. Then you also have some other elements, such as the combo meter and the way the magic system works. But the way the upgrades work, by letting you unlock individual attacks rather than upgrading weapons altogether, as well as an emphasis on ranged combat with the guns, this is caught somewhere between a God of War knockoff and a Devil May Cry knockoff, which, as I've always said, are two very distinct flavors of hack and slash. But out of all the games I've covered on this series, this is definitely the one most unlike God of War that I've ever covered. But I feel that I'm too far past the precipice to not get my pound of flesh in this case, because this is genuinely one of the worst games I've ever played. Normally this would be the part where I recap the plot, but genuinely, I'm not even going to begin to get into that, because I'll say right off the bat, I did not finish this game, so I can't speak on the plot because I did not see it through. And quite frankly, I was so bored I was barely paying attention to what was going on screen. Well, that is other than when I was looking at this main character's design and thinking about how embarrassed I was. Now, I'm going to be walking a minefield with this one, but let me just say for the record, there's a fine line between characters being attractive and whatever the hell this is. I didn't comment on Naruko's character design because I felt that she was somewhat on the sensible side of absurdity. If they were attempting to make her a female Kratos, she dresses more sensibly than him. Was she made specifically to be an attractive female character? Probably, but it still comes across as somewhat sensible. Ayumi from X-Blades, on the other hand, is something I'm embarrassed to look at. This is the type of thing that gives gaming as a whole a bad rep. It comes across as insulting to me because given the state of the game, it's almost communicating the idea that they thought that they could attempt to sell a game purely off the back of having an underdressed female character on the front cover. It's one of two things. Either Gaijin Entertainment is universally shameless, or they thought that gamers are all universally shameless enough to buy this sight unseen, meaning they have absolutely no respect for their audience. And hey, I'm just gonna tell you right now, if YouTube doesn't like her character design, don't be surprised if this part of the video gets cut in the future, because that thong is so small it's in danger of disappearing. I'd say the whole thing is audacious, but it comes across to me as cynical, especially when you take into consideration that they were likely attempting to use this character to sell a game as bad as this one. I won't waste too much time on this one because it's pretty self-explanatory. The production value for a start is awful. The graphics are pretty bad even for 2010, and a lot of the HUD elements feel so amateurish. Like how some of the in-game font is Comic Sans. Literally, it feels like a parody. Or how about how they left gaps in the experience counter as if they're supposed to be commas, but then they didn't put the commas in. And then there's not a lot of visual flair to the graphics, like how characters will pop in with a token animation, or how the level complete sign is just a basic text pop-up that rolls on screen. I could make this in Photoshop in like 5 minutes. There, I did it. Or how about how stiff and janky all the animations are? And aside from being stiff and janky, the animations just don't flow from one to another smoothly whatsoever. Just look at this double jump, or how when you shoot in the air, you'll stutter while floating down. So many amateurish mistakes. I mean, I could go over so many individual aspects of the presentation, but I feel like this should become pretty self-explanatory as we see more of the game. It honestly looks and feels like, at worst, one of those crappy digital homicide games that got crapped out every other week back in the day, or at best, and I can't believe I'm saying this, a college project. Like something that a passionate game developer would make as a final project in game design school, and if that were the level we were talking about here, I could actually get behind this. The problem is, this is a relatively big studio that sold this game for full price, and the amateurishness really shines through on the gameplay front. Basically, this game operates in several individual sectioned off areas where you have to accomplish a specific task before moving on. Each of these sectioned off areas are considered their own level. Sometimes making progress involves you fighting off wave after wave after wave of samey enemies. You hack and slash and shoot, and you have a bar at the bottom corner of the screen that you need to empty by doing something. Kinda like what Asura's Wrath did, except a million times worse. Sometimes it's obvious, like just killing all the enemies in the room, or maybe it'll be the health bar for a boss, or you need to destroy all these flying orbs that spawn enemies, but other times it's completely not self-explanatory, or maybe what you need to do is self-explanatory, but you won't know how to do what you're supposed to do. For example, there's this one level with this boss, but I don't know how to damage it, so I basically have to run down the list of my abilities one by one, looking for the one attack or combination of attacks that'll damage it. Or that one boss that you can only damage after eliminating all the individual minions, but it takes so long to eliminate the minions in order to get a few seconds of space to damage this giant moth or whatever that I wasn't sure if I was even doing the correct thing. And it's really irritating because it's like every single level in this game has a puzzle that you have to solve but won't let you know what the puzzle is and essentially forces you to figure it out by yourself and doesn't even give you the means to figure it out in a self-explanatory way. So you're stumbling in the dark trying to figure out what you're supposed to do. I'd say most of the levels are relatively self-explanatory in this regard, but it's that 30% that I just get stuck on. And it doesn't help that every single task is drawn out ad nauseum. This is the second most padded game I've ever played. Every single individual segment takes at least 10 times as long as it needs to. Like, yeah, I appreciate the levels where you have to fight horde after horde for at least being straightforward, but it just never ends. It's especially egregious in the levels where you have those enemies that can clip through the walls, so you have to wait for them. In some of these cases, it was to the point that there are times when I'm not even sure what I'm doing is what I'm supposed to be doing. Like this spike room that goes on for something like 5 minutes before you get to the actual meat of the level. I thought I'd hit a glitch or something. And it's really irritating when you combine a game that doesn't tell you what you need to do in order to make progress with overly long segments of gameplay. It makes it so that even if you do figure things out, well, you're probably gonna have to do it again anyway because you took too much damage figuring it out and now you have to try again with the benefit of hindsight. Good luck doing that over the next 10 minutes. And they have the gall to make you go through every individual segment multiple times. You have to do multiple loops of the same world layout, so if they cut out all the chaff and just had you moving through this game with the same progression as any other game, X-Blades would be like 10 minutes long. But then we get to the real killing blow, the actual combat itself. This is some of the worst audio-visual feedback I've ever felt in a game. There is absolutely no oomph to the combat because the enemies barely react to my swipes. It feels like the enemies and Ayumi exist on separate planes of existence that only kind of coexist. Because you swipe your blades and they go right through the enemies with very little to indicate that they've taken damage. So it does not feel good to slash through the various hordes of enemies. And that theory about not coexisting on the same plane of existence is also furthered by the fact that enemies can shoot through walls. Jesus wept. And since there's only one main combo and some others that you can unlock as well as no block command, a really arcane dodge mechanic, and no real way to avoid damage, the controls are 50 shades of AIDS. It just turns this into a mindless button masher where you're mashing the X button at hordes of enemies without any strategy and occasionally using a magic attack until you can move on to the next horde. It's so repetitive. There's no appeal. There's no satisfaction to be gleaned from the combat, no strategy to make you think and potentially feel clever. It's slow and boring and agonizing, and it might just be one of the worst games I've ever played. Like, looking at this game, it almost feels like a fake game you'd see on a TV show. As a matter of fact, when I was younger, young enough that the internet wasn't really a big thing, smartphones were still a few years out, and the only thing I really had to entertain myself was basic cable, I used to throw on a lot of TV shows that I didn't necessarily like, but could tolerate. Well, there was this one show called Life with Derek that did an episode tackling female representation in video games, and the game in question was called Babe Raider, obviously a take on Tomb Raider. But playing this game reminded me of the brief scenes where we saw the game in that episode. I ended up playing X-Blades for about 4 hours, because any longer than that and I feel like my soul would have been devoured. The part where I ended up stopping was the section where I had to fight these spiders to make the bar go down, I think. But anytime I tried to attack them, they would disappear, so I had to figure out how to kill them before they could disappear. I found the earthquake attack worked decently, but the amount of progress I was making per spider was so little that I probably would have been there for 30 minutes had I not succumbed to the army of lizard men. I put my controller down, I threw in the towel, and waved the white flag. Whatever this game is about, I tried, but I can't put up with a game that is simultaneously not fun to play and has no respect for my time, because it just feels like an insult. I don't enjoy being angry at a game. I genuinely don't. I find that type of thing to be crass and extremely passé. But genuinely, I felt that I couldn't not talk about X-Blades after what it put me through. F*** this game, I'm out. Alright, confession time. So I was originally gonna have this entry consist of the game 2 Human, but I opted not to for a few reasons. One, it's really not as much like God of War as I was led to believe based on the commenters who told me to cover it. 2, it's really long, and 3, it looked awful. So to hell with that, I opted instead to play a game I had in reserve, namely Knight's Contract. A game made by Game Republic and published by Bandai Namco in 2011. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I actually had some excitement for this one because Bandai Namco are low-key one of the better publishers out there. They tend to put their names on halfway decent games a lot more often than some other publishers. Plus, Game Republic also made Clash of the Titans previously, another God of War style game, so hopes were high. Does Knight's Contract live up to that? Well, let's see. The premise is, we're in a slightly fantasized version of the Middle Ages. So there was a coven of witches with ultra-long lifespans that helped humankind for hundreds of years, but an alchemist named Dr. Faust seeks the power of the witches, and in particular the 7 pieces of the Mina del Monde. 7 pieces of a crystal that would give him ultimate power. So in order to obtain the crystals, the alchemist creates the Black Death and blames it on the witches, resulting in each of their executions, but he fails to get the final piece from the final witch, Gretchen. Now it's 100 years later and we play as Heinrich, the executioner who Gretchen cursed with immortality. Meanwhile, Gretchen has acquired a new body called a homunculus, and since death literally means less in this world than Dragon Ball Z, the souls of the other 6 witches are still earthbound and wreaking havoc, raising the dead, unleashing powerful monsters, and generally causing hell on Earth. Gretchen and Heinrich then perform a blood pact that binds their life forces together until such a time that the Mina del Monde is sealed and the other witches' souls are put to rest, hence the Knight's Contract title. This game certainly has decently complex morality, because I remember playing through the opening thinking to myself, who am I supposed to root for in this case? Because the humans are a bunch of gullible idiots who killed innocent witches who just wanted to help, but the witches have now come back to exact horrible revenge on humans. I'm assuming none of which were alive 100 years prior during their executions. Justified as they may be, an eye for an eye still makes the whole world blind. But then Gretchen showed up, and she still believes in the code of ethics that the witches are supposed to follow, even despite all of the atrocities that the humans committed, which I think ties into the conversation she had with Dr. Faust right before her execution, where Dr. Faust admitted how easy it was to trick the humans into believing the witches were responsible. So presumably she understands that humans are not bad by nature, and the only crime they're guilty of is being stupid. How relevant. So humanity is essentially caught in the crossfire between people committing arguably justified revenge and a madman operating completely to his own benefit. This is actually a surprisingly nuanced story in some ways, how both Gretchen and Heinrich kind of represent the righteous parallel to the people they're fighting against. Gretchen has every reason to be bitter, but she chooses to uphold her morality despite everything, and Dr. Faust seeks true immortality, whereas Heinrich has that immortality already, but he views it as a curse, and he wants nothing more than to have the curse end. But in the end, he comes to view his curse as a gift, accepting his fate as one of the new protectors of humanity alongside Gretchen. A simple but compelling arc. There is some good stuff here, and while the dialogue isn't the best, I think the voice acting is pretty damn good. Laura Bailey, as always, is a particular standout.
Neither Straggle nor Trude would ever bring harm on others by spreading something like the Black Death. They were all kind and loving. They did nothing to deserve such treatment. But now they have sunk to the level of the witches they were accused of being.
I give her performance a 9 iron out of 10. So yeah, I think of all the games I've covered in this particular subgenre, this story kept me invested better than probably any of them. As for the gameplay, well, once again, the controls and overall gameplay is extremely similar to God of War. It doesn't have a fixed camera, which may give this game the superficial appearance of something that's entirely different, but the controls are basically identical, with a few small differences, like how X is dodge roll instead of the analog stick, seeing as they needed actual camera controls. But otherwise, yeah, this game pretty much knows exactly what it wants to be, which is not a bad thing. I will admit at first, this game wasn't really grabbing me, but then I started to understand exactly what this game was going for. So you don't really have that many actual combos at first. They kind of cheat and seemingly include different combo entries for the same combos except where you slash left or right. I tried to see if they had different animations, and if they did, I couldn't get them to activate. So near as I could tell, all they did was change direction. So your core group of combos is seemingly very small, and so the combat may seem somewhat vapid. That is until they started to implement the different attacks that Gretchen can perform. It's not like your regular magic attack where you have to use a set amount of mana. These are attacks that usually only get one enemy, and they cool down, and the cooldown is comparatively short. What you're supposed to do is string together unorthodox combos using both magic and your regular attacks. Once I figured that out and really started to get into the whole stacking combos thing as well as the quick time event finishing moves, I actually really started to enjoy myself. It's unorthodox, but that's kind of why I like it. And thankfully, as the game goes on, you do acquire more abilities and more combos until you have a good set of both magic and combo attacks. They really ramp things up. They don't want to overwhelm the player too quickly, so by the time the whole of the game's mechanics are in play, you understand what the game expects of you well enough that it's not overwhelming. But due to the unorthodox nature of the combat engine, they did kind of need to have a smaller amount of combos by default. Makes sense to me. And there are a lot of different things you can play around with in order to alter your playstyle. Different amulets you can wear, and all sorts of different attacks you can map to your 4 magic slots. Some are for Gretchen, some are for Heinrich, so there's a surprising amount of variety here to play around with, and once you do find a slightly unique playstyle that works for you, getting those combos and switching between magic attacks and regular attacks is quite thrilling. Especially when you get those massive point bonuses for long uninterrupted combos. Although that really only goes towards your grade at the end of the episode, so if you're into that, it's worth it. Otherwise, it's just kinda cool, I guess. And you also have a couple of different magic attacks that go beyond the standard magic attacks of the game. Essentially, if you fill up this bar right under Gretchen's health, you can use a number of different attacks. One of them is essentially Heinrich's Rage of the Gods mode, which is great during those tough boss fights, or even during the standard fights with elite enemies. But the other ones I'm not so sure about. I'm just gonna describe it because I basically can't show it. Okay, so you have a pre-rendered cutscene of a naked ethereal Gretchen, who then basically destroys whatever enemy you use it on, including one attack where she becomes a giantess and basically squishes the enemy between her legs. I mean, as far as killing enemies, it does the job just fine, but all I can imagine here is a desperately sweating board member who was pitching this for weeks until they decided to implement it, basically just to shut him up, because that is low-key one of the horniest things I've ever seen in a game. So Knight's contract at its base level is pretty good. However, it does commit one cardinal sin of game design that I can absolutely not let slide. So Heinrich is invincible. This also applies to the gameplay where he can be temporarily disabled and even chopped into tiny bits so gruesome that I'm not even sure YouTube will let me show them on screen, but he'll always come back so long as you can just mash X enough. So you may be wondering how the challenge comes into that. Well, the danger is not with letting Heinrich die, usually. It's allowing him to be incapacitated enough to allow Gretchen to die, or otherwise allowing her to die in standard combat. Because if she dies, that's the game over state. Essentially making this game one giant escort quest.
Goodness gracious, great balls of shoot me.
Yeah, this is not good. Here's the thing, I can generally control the amount of damage I take just by playing well, but Gretchen has no self-preservation instinct to get out of the way of major attacks, which causes her to get absolutely stomped. In the battles with general grunts, she usually does just fine so long as she enters the battle with a relatively good amount of health, but the bosses are where shit hits the fan. Because obviously they do the most damage. Like, for example, the very first boss fight in the game, I died 3 times. The boss is actually really easy, but Gretchen kept getting caught up in her attacks, so I had to keep restarting. That's the level we're dealing with here, and it gets so frustrating when you get knocked down or get blown into tiny chunklets that Gretchen just kinda stands near you. Even if she's right in front of the mouth of a giant snake. Even regardless of that, any game where your success or failure relies on factors completely independent of the player doesn't make for a good time. Though the healing aspect is funny. If she ever gets to low health, you tap R1 near her and she'll jump into your arms, which will speed up her healing process. I have so many comments I can make about that, they're all causing a massive traffic pile up in my brain. I'd say for most of the game I could ignore the companion aspect, but when it hits like a freight train. It can really kill the pace of some of those larger fights, and even in the general exploration, sometimes you'll just be casually walking around the level and then Gretchen will call out to you as if she's suffering, all because she's slightly more than 20 feet behind you. It's to the point that it almost feels like you have to carry her around like a child. And make no mistake, some of these levels are actually quite explorable. In fact, this game uses a similar episode structure to Asura's Wrath, and I kinda think that this is the game I wanted Asura's Wrath to be, at least from a structural standpoint, where there are fairly hefty railroaded sections of story, but there's also levels that have a bit of exploration, sometimes to the point that you can even get lost. And I'm okay with that, because I'd prefer something that's a little bit too open than a little bit too railroaded. Now, there's another thing here I'm not too fond of. I understand in this genre, QuickTime events are basically inevitable, but is it so much to ask that they're done well? Much like most games in the genre, there's a significant amount of QuickTime events, as well as semi-interactive moments that are essentially QuickTime events. You know, where you have free reign to move, but if you don't do the exact pre-designated thing, you'll die. And QuickTime events, as well as their variations, have never really been that fun, but at the very least you can make them inoffensive by not penalizing the player too much for failure. Knight's Contract doesn't quite understand this. If you don't press the correct button, or you aren't Speedy Gonzales in these sequences, you have to redo the entire thing again. Matter of fact, for the boss fights, you have these ending sequences with long, drawn-out QuickTime events, and if you fail, you have to not only redo the entire sequence again, but you also have to do the last chunk of the boss fight again. I'm sorry if I think that sending you back 2 minutes of gameplay on account of failing a split-second reaction is complete crap. But no, I'm actually not sorry. Okay, well, in this game's defense, I don't think the flaws of Knight's Contract are enough to ruin my enjoyment. I find the combat stimulating enough that I was enjoying the game pretty much top to bottom, helped out quite a bit by the uniqueness. Then the setting, the story, the voice acting, it's all good. Plus, the imagery is suitably brutal, and as a metalhead, I appreciate that. Graphically, it leaves a bit to be desired, but that's totally fine. Despite the fact that Knight's Contract reviewed very poorly when it came out, I actually think this is a worthwhile time. Maybe not something I'll ever play again, but something that held my attention while it was there. There is a sort of cliffhanger at the end when Gretchen and Heinrich, having lived to the modern day, sense that there's some sort of unspecific evil afoot. And then there's also a giant glowing orb with tendrils coming out of the sky, so they were definitely intending to have a sequel set in the modern day. Much like Lords of Shadow 2 did. Unfortunately, this was actually the last Game by Game Republic who went out of business a mere 4 months after the game came out. So any potential for a sequel or a continuation was stomped into the ground right then and there. Tragic, but an all too common tale. Marlow, Briggs, and the Mask of Death is one of my most requested games to cover on this series. Before it was requested of me, I'd actually never heard of it. It was made by a company called Zootfly and came out in 2013. September of 2013, and let's just say my crosshairs were extremely locked on another game in September of 2013, along with the rest of the world. So this one slipped under my radar, but it's very obvious to me why it was recommended as a God of War style game, and it became quite obvious pretty much from the moment I got into gameplay. But this is another one that I'm extremely glad to have had been recommended, because as far as God of War style games, Marlow, Briggs, and the Mask of Death is extremely solid. Although it doesn't get a lot of its appeal from the plot. You are Marlow Briggs, but that's not important. Marlow is tagging alongside his girlfriend, Eva Torres, who is working as an interpreter in an archaeological site digging up Mayan ruins for a man named Heng Long. However, she attempts to resign, but Heng Long needs her to translate all the codex for less than palatable reasons. So to force Eva's compliance, instead of trying to negotiate or, offering her a massive raise, Heng Long decides to kill Marlow and kidnap Eva. Kind of drastic, but okay. However, he doesn't just shoot Marlow with a gun. Oh no, he decides to have Marlow stabbed with an artifact from the Mayan ruins, Kukulkan's fangs. You should know never to kill someone with an ancient weapon. Well, anyways, it wasn't the weapon that was their big mistake, it was actually the Mask of Death that was attached to the weapon itself, which housed the soul of a long-dead Mayan king, who then revives Marlow.
Save your breath, Miss Torres. There is no God here.
Ironic.
You got all that? So now Marlow has to go on a journey to rescue his girlfriend from Long, who wants to use Eva's translation skill as well as a rare supernatural mineral to attain ultimate, unspeakable godlike power. The story is extremely simple. It's essentially just a framing device to get things going, and then the game's almost nothing but gameplay until the end. I'd say a lot of the plot elements are added rather obligatorily, like how one of Long's associates, Kim, the person who initially killed Marlow, is actually a double agent who ends up helping Marlow. Personally, I would find it hard to trust somebody who killed me, but I've only been in that situation a handful of times, so I guess I don't have much experience. But obligatory isn't the same as bad, it's just relatively standard, and there are some charming touches they add to the game, like how Aku Aku here gives you some humorous running commentary.
Friends of yours?
Hardly. They are the harbingers of death and destruction.
Don't you have any nice gods? You know, like a god of hugs or high fives or something?
There is Akan, the god of wine and musical belching.
That's more like it.
And there is Saraya, goddess of erotic delights and habitation.
And that's where you lost.
I especially like his sarcastic remarks if you stop moving for a while.
Okay, whenever you're ready, just take your time. I understand. The scenery is beautiful.
But otherwise, there's really not much to write home about on the story front. It's extremely by-the-numbers video game storytelling for the time, which I honestly find a bit charming. As much as I like the modern storytelling standard, it's nice to revisit a game from an era when not everything had to be so worthy. And even without the story elements, the game kicks ass, so who cares? As far as games that copy God of War, this is up there with the likes of Dante's Inferno and X-Men Origins Wolverine as far as the level of shamelessness. It's in a modern setting, so you're going to be dealing with more generic-looking grunts in army fatigues, but they understand the importance of enemy variety, so you'll be fighting an equal amount of the local fauna as well as the natives, which are a lot more visually interesting than generic grunts. In fact, they do an impressive amount of effort into keeping the setting contemporary but still visually striking both as far as the enemies as well as the environments are concerned. This lends this game the distinction of still very much holding up visually, despite its age. I mean, the cutscene animation is butt ugly, and that's even when they decide to have cutscene animation and don't have these glorified slideshows, but once you're in gameplay and everything's in motion, I actually think it's a very good looking game. Very lush, very colorful, very striking, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. I have a friend who is quoted as saying, "It amazes me that this game somehow still looks better than Sonic Frontiers." Now, moving on from that as quickly as my feet can take me. Gameplay-wise, this game is essentially identical to God of War in its controls. Light attack, heavy attack, a fixed camera, dodge being mapped to the right thumbstick, you know the drill. I mean, any game that includes a combo that ends with an area of effect attack where you bash your weapon into the ground knows exactly what it wants to be. And there are quite a few ideas here lifted directly from God of War, including that thing where you have elite enemies that you can take control of once you get them down below a certain level of health. Like I said, it's pretty shameless, but it's also fun. The gameplay is smooth, it flows pretty well, the controls are responsive, and I've probably already said variations on this phrase 1,000 times because there's only so many ways to say this, but it just feels good to slice and dice the hordes of enemies in front of you. The combat really packs a punch, and the impact and feedback lends this combat engine the feeling of pure satisfaction. And there's a decent amount of enemy variety that makes it worth it to experiment with various styles and various combos. The main, and let's be honest, sole weapon in Marlow Briggs is Kukulkan's Fangs, but as you go on, you're given different variations that the weapon can transform into. You start off with the Scythe version, which is mid-range as far as attack and speed, so it was definitely the best weapon to start you out with. Then later on, you get the short-range dual-blade version, quick with good damage, but the lack of range forces you into the action to use it. Then you have the whip version, which is long-range, can hit several enemies at the same time, and is pretty quick, but it suffers damage-wise. And finally, the hammer version. Slow but devastating, so it's hard to get combos off, but if you do, it's definitely worth the effort. So there's enough to the combat engine that it allows you to experiment to your taste. I found the dual blades to be my general go-to because the lack of range was more than a fair trade-off for the damage and speed, but I found that none of these weapon variations were imbalanced to the point that I would never use them. The hammer especially was my general go-to when it came to these giant dudes, because they're slow enough that even your slowest combos are doable, and they also tank damage like crazy, so the more you can deal, the better. And a little touch that I liked was how it told you what combo you did every time you pulled one off. It's not something that I would like in every game, but it's a neat touch here that helps identify what the best attacks are, and amazingly, this game has a pretty decent amount of combos for every weapon variation. Which doesn't sound like it should be an accomplishment, but there's a surprising amount of God of War style games that have very few combos. Which is kind of a sticking point for me. It's the thing that elevates a decent God of War clone into being a great God of War clone. Useful and worthwhile variety. So it definitely feels like there's a level of thought and effort that went into Marlow Briggs that I can really appreciate. There are a few combos I found myself coming back to, but much like the weapon variations themselves, I didn't find anything not worth using, and it's all fun to use, so no harm, no foul. Plus, you're also given various magic attacks as you progress. You start off with a fire attack, which is already ridiculous. But later you get an earth, ice, and wind attack. I'm not prepared to say which of these attacks are the most useful, if any. I went into this game blind, so maybe there's an answer that I don't have. But the magic is still useful either way. At least the main magic attacks are useful. You also have a small projectile you can toss around, which uses a bit of your mana, but it's so ineffectual you're better off just hoarding your mana until you can use one of the main attacks. And to be fair, a useless attack that you have no reason to use isn't really a flaw, it's just a bit of extra skin hanging off this game that you can safely ignore. Especially seeing as you collect mana pretty quickly, enough that you can fill up your entire bar multiple times per fight, so you practically have no reason to use this projectile. The only somewhat sizable complaint I have about the combat system are the upgrades. The essence of having XP that you can use to upgrade things with is picking and choosing which upgrades most optimally fit your playstyle. But they basically give you enough XP in this game, assuming you're collecting all the optional XP, to fully upgrade every new weapon variation or magic attack in time to get the new weapon variation or magic attack. You are literally given more XP than you know what to do with, which is either a flaw or a feature depending on your perspective. I fully upgraded everything in the game with time to spare. I feel like making you choose could actually be an interesting quandary if they implemented it to where there was a choice. Because this game actually does something unique in that every time you upgrade the different forms of your weapon, you get a small upgrade to your health, and the same applies for your mana when you upgrade your magic attacks. Having to choose not only which weapon is the most useful to your playstyle, but also having to choose between health and mana upgrades at the same time could theoretically be a pretty difficult choice. But unfortunately, there is no choice, which is slightly deflating. Now, I'd say the most unique mechanic in this game is the ability to convert enemies to your side. This usually only works on minor enemies, but if you grapple them with the B button, then rapidly mash the B button, you go full wololo, and now these enemies are fighting on your side. You may be mistaken into thinking it's a pointless mechanic, but it actually is pretty overpowered. Because even if they only take a small amount of hits, you can convert pretty much every minor enemy on the battlefield, and there's seemingly no time limit. Once they're converted until they're killed by you, another enemy, or spontaneously combust. And the most important part is that the conversion also diverts aggro away from you, and in some of these fights, that's incredibly useful. Because in some of these battles, you need every single advantage you can get. The absolute hardest part of the game for me was this one section where you have these giant enemies who look like they eat SUVs for breakfast. This is at least one of a very small handful of fights in the game with absolutely no minor enemies. And more to the point, these enemies complement each other. It's hard to get a good combo going on the ranged enemies because of the melee enemies and vice versa. But if you get a ranged enemy down to low enough health, you can convert them, and it really just shows how useful the conversion mechanic is because you practically get an example A and an example B of how difficult a fight can be when you do and don't have someone who can divert aggro. So Marlow Briggs does enough to definitely elevate itself beyond the average God of War-like game, enough that I thoroughly enjoyed the combat that it dished out, as well as the rest of the game, from top to bottom. But there are some other bits and pieces to this game that I found kind of obnoxious. This game, shall we say, likes to switch things up. Now, this game does have puzzle sequences, but that's not what I'm talking about here. The puzzle sequences in this game are usually pretty good, with the right amount of intuitiveness that you never get stuck. Well, most of the time. There was this one puzzle, but that was because it wasn't quite clear what order you were supposed to hit the switches in. But once again, that's not the topic of conversation here. A game switching things up with slightly fiddly platforming sequences is fine, even if the edge collision doesn't work all the time. Having entirely separate fiddly and superfluous game modes is another thing. It's like the game is saying, oh, you think we're a God of War clone? Well, does God of War have turret sections and Xavius minigames? No, for good reason. This is about as mechanically vapid and unappealing as it gets. Oh, and did I mention fiddly? I mean, the sliding thing integrates decently into the main gameplay, but this is just a different game. It's a wonder how they didn't add this and question what they were doing with their lives. It's also a wonder why they decided to tie XP bonuses into these minigames. Like, yes, some of the biggest XP bonuses in the game aren't actually tied to the thing the game is built around. Putting that aside, I would definitely consider this a worthwhile way to spend 6 to 8 hours if you're a fan of classic God of War. Unfortunately, this game ends on a cliffhanger, hence why it's on a failed franchises list. At the Mask's request, Marlow uses Long's power to rewind time to the historical Mayan Empire, which is obviously supposed to set up a sequel that never happened. But with that, why did we never get a second Marlow Briggs game? Well, I'm no expert on the subject, but I think it has something to do with Zootfly, the developers, being bought out by and or merged with a company called Interblock shortly after the release of Marlow Briggs and the Mask of Death. Interblock was a company that focused primarily on casino games, so the days of Zootfly making games for the average person was over, and with that, we never saw a follow-up. Which is a shame, because this is definitely a game series with a lot of potential. I feel like I've said that, 3 times now? And the Mayan setting is very interesting, but that's all water under the bridge, unfortunately. There's probably no chance of us ever getting a sequel, and the public interest in the IP probably faded pretty quickly after the game came out. So it is what it is. I would have liked to see Marlow Briggs get his flowers, because this game was great, but alas, 'tis not the world in which we live. Alright, well that was fun, until it wasn't, and then it became fun again. That's 5 more games in the books. As far as ranking the games I've covered today, I think X-Blades places in last by a very wide margin, then probably Heavenly Sword next to that, but much further in front. Followed by Asura's Wrath, then Knight's Contract, and the winner of today is definitely Marlow Briggs and the Mask of Death. It's funny how the running themes of today were games that didn't have a block button, as well as games that showcased a lot more potential than was delivered upon. It's a shame that none of these games ever got the chance to expand and build on their ideas, with the exception of X-Blades, because in no universe is that a game that was ever going to be good. But for the other 4, it's a shame they've largely been left to the sands of time. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, ad-free viewing, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to users Brooklyn, Deep Betch, Gaw004, Cotton Swab, Christopher Fulton, Layabout, My Name is Tank, FarmCat84, Raph, Ty Trovey, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!